Good morning. We're going to finish the story of Jephthah this morning, which we started last Sunday. Jephthah's story basically occupies Judges 10 through 12. And just to kind of recap a little bit before we finish the story. So remember, we're told first of all that Israel has descended into sort of outright paganism. They've forsaken the Lord. They're serving the other gods. They've forsaken the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're worshiping all the Canaanite gods. And so God allows the Ammonites to oppress them, and then the people of Israel go looking for a deliverer, and they go and find Jephthah, who has the reputation of being a mighty warrior. And as I noted last time, it's important to sort of note, right, that in finding Jephthah, right, they don't really consult God at all. They just say, well, hey, we need someone impressive to lead us. Jephthah seems to be that kind of man. We'll call him. And he's invited to be their head and leader, in effect, a kind of a king. And so that's on the table as well. And then two important things happen that we just want to note before moving on. Thing number one, before Jephthah goes into battle, he does something interesting. And this is in Judges 11:11. It's so brief that you could easily miss it, but I think it's one of these important little details. So 11:11 says, "So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them." So there's that. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. That is, what apparently happens here is that Jephthah makes some sort of vow or promise to God. Now that sounds good, right? That sounds like a nice thing to do. But the really important thing here that we don't want to miss, right, is that a vow is somewhat dependent upon the kind of God you think you're making the vow to. So it's important to notice here, what we don't have of any mention of here is we don't have any mention of covenant. We don't have any mention of Jephthah being aware that God has been involved in Israel's history. We don't have any sense that Jephthah understands himself to sort of be carrying on in the tradition that was established by Moses and Joshua. What we have, apparently, is Jephthah sort of thinks of God in the same way that he thinks of all the other pagan gods and goddesses. Okay? And it's something like this. If you give me success, I'll do something good for you. If you give me success, then I'll do something good for you. That is, the Canaanite gods and goddesses are such that you can bargain with them. In other words, right, part of your job as a person who aspires to glory, right, is to convince these pagan gods and goddesses that you're someone who's like worth working with. Okay? Whereas with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's not an issue. Okay? Whether God goes out and he finds people that sometimes are great, sometimes not so great. So Jephthah believes that he's working with just another pagan god. And this will become important for what happens next. So the story continues. We're told in Judges 11:27 that God has already decided to give the Israelites victory over the Ammonites. Really important point, right? So what's about to happen, the victory that's about to happen, actually has nothing to do with Jephthah at all. He's just kind of like there. And so here's what happens. This is Judges 11:29. The Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. So we're told here that the Spirit of God comes upon Jephthah. He goes through part of Israel to kind of raise an army, and then heads out to battle. Now, this is a really important theological point here that I want to underline. In the Old Testament, the Spirit of God periodically comes upon different people to empower them for certain missions and certain purposes. We just want to make sure that we recognize that in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God coming upon someone is not necessarily associated with that person becoming holy or wise or faithful. And surely that's surely the case with Jephthah. We don't see much holiness, wisdom, or faithfulness in him, and the Spirit's come upon him. I say that because once we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, we get a somewhat different and maybe sort of more in-depth picture of the work of the Spirit. So I want to read to you a really important passage from the prophet Joel. And this is a passage that may or may not be familiar, but it's important because this is the passage that Peter quotes from in his sermon on the day of Pentecost. So remember what happens in Acts 2, the nucleus of the early church, which at this point is the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the 11 apostles, and Matthias, who's been chosen to succeed Judas. They're all present. The Holy Spirit descends upon them, and we get a much more in-depth picture of the work of the Spirit. Here, the work of the Spirit actually does bring with him wisdom and holiness and transformation. But we're not to that point here in Judges. But I want to just underline something for you, because in Micah here, or excuse me, in Joel 2:28, Joel says something that's really important. He says, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days will I pour out my Spirit." And then in 2:32, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." So really important sort of picture, right? Joel's looking ahead to a time that's different from the time that we're looking at in Judges, when two things are going to be different. Thing number one, instead of being poured out on simply certain individuals temporarily for certain missions, the Holy Spirit is going to be poured out upon all of God's people as a kind of permanent gift. And instead of simply empowering people to do certain things for a certain period of time, the Holy Spirit's going to be poured out for radical transformation. So notice the difference here, right? We move from only certain people receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit to all of God's people receiving the gift of the Spirit. And we move from the Spirit simply empowering people to do specific things to the Holy Spirit becoming, in effect, a permanent gift and presence among God's people. But we're not there yet. So we just want to recognize that that's what's going on. So off Jephthah goes into battle, and here's what happens on the way. And this is Judges 11:30. "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said," now notice this, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I shall offer it up for a burnt offering." So here's the bargain, at least in Jephthah's mind. Jephthah says, look, God, if you will give me victory, which, by the way, God's already decided, if you'll give me victory, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that walks out of my house when I return home in victory. Now think about that for a moment. Obviously, right, at one level, this is certainly a bargain with God. Okay? This is along the lines of, God, I'm late for my appointment. If you could just change that red light to green, I will pray every day this week. To which God is, probably saying to himself, yeah, right. That is, this is Jephthah's sort of bargain with God. If you'll give me this, I'll do that. Now, once again, right, we have to notice something. Thing number one. Remember that this is Israel, right? And there are only certain kinds of sacrifices that can be made for certain kind of purposes. Jephthah ignores all of that. Point number two, there's a prescribed method in which sacrifices are to be offered, according to the law of Moses. Jephthah ignores all of that. Once again, this helps us to see that Jephthah thinks of God as basically another pagan deity. If you'll do this for me, I will offer you a burnt offering from whatever walks out of my house when I get home in victory. So at one level, right, this is like theologically wrong. So there's one thing. There's another thing that's at work here too, and we're about to find out what that thing is, right? The other thing that's wrong about this is it's also like dumb. What is likely to be the first thing that walks out of his house when he gets home? Yes! His wife or some member of his family that he's now proposing to offer as a burnt offering. That is, this is like stupid. Okay? This is like, some of you may remember the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Remember what the prophets of Baal end up doing? Remember they've got this like sacrifice contest going on, and they're like these two offerings on piles of wood, and the idea is, right, the first god that sends fire down on the wood and lights the fire and you get a burning fire, that's the God that's somehow real. And so prophets of Baal are dancing around their sacrifice, and they're really getting frustrated because Baal isn't answering. And so the longer the doesn't answer, the more they sort of amp up the activity, right? And they start shouting and screaming for Baal, and then they start like slashing themselves with knives to kind of draw Baal's attention, and that doesn't do it, and so it moves on. That is, it goes from one dumb thing to even like dumber things. That's kind of what happens here. And so, to complete the story, here's what happens. If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return home in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hands. So notice, right? Once again, right? God's providing the victory. This has nothing to do with Jephthah's vow. It has nothing to do with potential sacrifices of any kind. All that sort of like irrelevant. And he struck them from Ur to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities as far as Abel-Canarim, with a great blow. And so the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Okay? Right. Victory. Okay? Ammonites subdued, peace from the land, prosperity. Jephthah gets on his white horse to ride back home in victory. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. Until Judges 11:34. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low." No, you brought yourself low, Jephthah, stupid. "And you have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." In other words, Jephthah, you're getting what you deserve. That is, Jephthah returns. He's made this pagan vow. And lo and behold, the first thing that walks out of the door when he gets home is his daughter, who also happens to be his only child. Now, we want to kind of, once again, think about the implications of this for a minute, because they're not apparent on the surface. Once again, right, Jephthah is proposing to offer a human sacrifice to God. Now, you may remember a couple years ago when we were working our way through the book of Leviticus. I think that was during the first Reagan administration. You may remember that out of all the sacrifices that were enumerated in the book of Leviticus, right, human sacrifice is not one of them. Okay? As a matter of fact, one of the things that we'll find as the Old Testament goes on is the Israelites will adopt the practice of human sacrifice, and that will have to be condemned repeatedly. Particularly the thing that really catches on and never really quite goes away, really, is the worship of the god Moloch, M-O-L-E-C-H. And Moloch was worshipped by offering infants as sacrifices. And so there was this big kind of pit of fire, and people would worship Moloch by taking a newborn infant and tossing them into this pit of fire. The idea here being, right, that you're giving Moloch something that's valuable to you, with the idea that he'll then do something really great for you in return. There's that bargain. Okay? We, of course, want to notice, right, that there's a huge irony in this, right? The people of Israel developed the idea that by offering human sacrifice of their own children to the god Moloch, they're going to be blessed. When in fact, right, what actually turns out to be the case is they're blessed by God offering his son. And this is where Christianity becomes really, we can talk about this later on, but right, this is where Christianity becomes like really, really radical in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the world of paganism, Greek paganism, Roman paganism, Persian paganism, right, is a world that's filled with people who are sacrificing things to gods to get the God's favor. Christianity becomes the only religion where people don't sacrifice to God, but God sacrifices for them. So the whole religion and way of looking at things in the ancient world is like turned on its head by Christianity. More about that later. So now Jephthah's in a dilemma. He's going to have to sacrifice his daughter. And I think that one of the things that's going on here is that Judges is wanting us to see that one of the awful things about paganism, practiced here by Jephthah, is, right, you end up doing things that you really don't need to do. That is, it's really important to grasp the fact, right, that Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter is going to accomplish absolutely nothing. He is going to sacrifice her as a burnt offering, not to get something in return from any god or goddess, but he's going to do it because he's stupid. That's it. He's stupid enough to buy into this whole way of thinking that you find among the Canaanites. And therefore, this kind of stands as sort of like, a warning. And so here's what happens. And she said to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do not do according to me as has gone out of your mouth. now the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites. And so she said to her father, let this thing be done to me. Leave me alone for 2 months that I may go up and down the mountains and weep for my virginity, for I and my companions. And he said, go. Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, and she and her companions wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did according to his vow that he had made. And she had never known a man, and as it became a custom in Israel, that the daughters of Israel went about year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days of the year. So, important notice here. Thing one, the young woman that Jephthah sacrifices is his only child, and therefore, guess what? Jephthah is going to be childless. Now, as you probably know, right, in the Old Testament, right, being childless is almost like a fate worse than death. A huge amount of significance is placed on having children and grandchildren and that kind of thing, right? So Jephthah is going to die basically without an inheritance because his only child is going to die. And then she goes for 2 months and laments her virginity. Laments the fact that she's going to die unmarried and not having born any children. And she ends up as a burnt offering. Now, I think we want to think about that for just a minute, because once again, I think the New Testament provides us with something else to think about. So 2 things I want to underline here that I think are really important theological things. At the end of Romans 11, Paul says something I think that is really important. And I'm going to read it to you. It's sort of like the conclusion of the long argument that runs from 9 to 11, which I am not going to attempt to summarize because that would take too long. But here's what Paul says. This is Romans 11, 34 to 35. This is part of a kind of like a doxology that Paul offers at the conclusion of the argument. And so here it is. This is actually 11:33 and following. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given him a gift that he might be repaid? Notice what Paul's doing there. Paul is reminding the Christians in Rome that the God that they worship is radically different from all the other gods that have glorious and grand temples in the city of Rome, whichever ones they are. And those two points of difference are these, right? Thing number one, who has ever served as God's advisor? Has God somehow ever felt it necessary to consult human beings because he was like missing some piece of wisdom? Okay? Now, maybe God's consulted you. Maybe God's come to you at some moment and said, Diane, I'm really confused about what I need to do about this. Can you help me here? And Diane provides a wonderful answer, as she always does. Paul says, no, it's unthinkable that God would seek out or need human advice. Why? Because he is wisdom, capital W itself. He doesn't need advisors or consultants. And the other big difference, right? Who has ever given anything to God that would then justify them sort of asking something in return? Okay, God, I did this for you. Now you need to do something good for me. Right? Paul's reminding the Christians in Rome, and he's also reminding us, right, that in respect to God, right, none of us ever are givers. With respect to God, right, we are always receivers. And there's a simple reason for that. And the simple reason, right, is that little word called creation. That is, when it comes to God's relationship to the creation, right, everything on this side of the creator-creature distinction, right, is on the receiving end of stuff, right? Life, blessings, health, whatever. Nobody, Paul says, has ever somehow done God a favor justifying God doing something else in return. That's the point that Jephthah misses. And that's why you can't bargain with God. So that's a really important theological point. A second point is this, and this comes from something that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, which I'll read part of it to you as well. This has to do with a very radical shift in the understanding of virginity between the Old and the New Testaments. So remember, the Jephthah's daughter laments the fact that she's dying a virgin. Never married, no children, all that kind of stuff. This is seen as like awful. We get a very different picture in the New Testament, particularly in 1 Corinthians 7, 32 to 35. Paul says something that I think is really interesting. He, first of all, in 1 Corinthians 7, 8, says to the Corinthians that he wishes that they were all as he was, that is, single and celibate. He kind of presents that as a model, and then he returns to the subject later on at the end of the chapter and says something really important that I think is really interesting. He says that the reason why he's kind of holding up singleness and celibacy as an ideal is, he says, that it frees one from anxieties and enables one to sort of render like wholehearted service to the Lord. So I just want to kind of offer just a brief reflection on that. I know that what Paul says may sound strange, but we want to kind of put that in a certain context. So one of the things that we find, right, in the New Testament is we find something very, very different than we find in the Old Testament, and it's what some people have called vocational celibacy. Right? So it's important to note, right, that kind of like the three big figures of the New Testament all practiced what some people call vocational celibacy. That is, celibacy to sort of free one for the wholehearted pursuit of a vocation. Of course, those three people are, in order of importance, Jesus, Paul, and John the Baptist. So notice what's going on here. Notice what Paul is saying. I think that, Paul's right. This is not a comment about sexuality somehow being like awful or bad or difficult, but rather Paul's saying, well, there's a thing that's called a calling, right? And sometimes what that calling means is it calls for single-hearted devotion to a cause or calling from God. Paul considers himself to be an example of that. So just want to kind of put that, in our minds and think through it. That is, notice what we have here. We have, in the church, we have this notion of these two forms of calling, right? Calling number one is calling to the vocation of marriage, which is a vocation, right? It's calling from God. It's a way of serving God. On the other hand, we also have a calling to celibacy, which is also a calling from God, which is to set one apart for a particular mission or a particular vocation. And so people will fall into one of those kind of two categories. In that light, right, it's really interesting to notice, this is where we'll stop. It's interesting, right, that very early on, and you can already see this in the Apostles' Creed, right? that the mother of Jesus acquires the title virgin as a proper title, right? We say that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. Here, virgin isn't just simply a descriptor of Mary's particular state, right? But it's a description of her calling. This is a vocational calling, right? The idea here is that Mary here has a calling in the purposes of God that she follows single-handedly in a way that actually is reminiscent of her son, John the Baptist, Paul himself, and other people who follow. All this is simply a way of saying, right, that one of the things that's really central to understanding what's going on in Judges and as that gets played out in the history of the early church, right, is that callings, vocations, or missions from God are really essential. And it's in remaining true to those callings or vocations that we maintain a life of faithfulness, right? And so one of the things that we sometimes do, it's actually an ancient tradition. One of the ancient traditions is that during Holy Week, diocesan clergy gather together and renew their ordination vows with their bishop. And this is a way of saying, right, okay, we're going into the most holy part of the Christian year. We're going into recalling the events of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. And as we do that, we're going to renew the vows and promises that we made when we were first ordained, either as deacons, priests, or to the episcopate. Why? Because being aware of your vocation and calling is essential to the proper ordering of your life. So one of the things I think we're being called to here, right, is first of all, we need to kind of mentally recall our own particular vocations, whether you were called to the vocation of marriage or whether you were called to the vocation of celibacy. And then we need to remember, right, the vocation that we were given in our baptism. Because it's in remembering those callings and living into them that we become faithful, so that you don't end up like Jephthah. Okay. Next Sunday, we're going to start the story of Samson, which is really interesting and really complex. And once we get through with that, then we will be ready to take a look at the two epilogues to the book of Judges. Judges has two epilogues, so we'll see how all that turns out.